Robin, welcome and thank you for joining us. And oh, Julian, and that was a marvelous presentation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Bronen, and I work as a human rights attorney and an interdisciplinary social scientist on what I consider one of the most greatest challenges related to the climate crisis, which is climate forced displacement. The land on which millions of people live in the United States and also globally is going to permanently disappear and displace millions of people. And the heart of the work, these are the people that I have the honor of working with. They are from 15 Alaska Native communities. And the heart of our work is to decolonize the systems that have caused the communities that we work with to face the awful issue of relocation. I'm looking to see how to move it forward. If somebody could please help me. So I want to start out with defining the terms that are critically important to our work. The first is colonization, and it's really important to understand that colonization is not only part of our historical past, but it is also part of our current system of governance. And it is the laws and policies that currently exist that are causing not only Alaska Native peoples, but peoples along the coastlines of the United States to think about how they are going to leave their homes. And in the most extreme instance, it is the forced government managed and mandated relocation, which has a long history here in the United States. And in Alaska, it happened most recently during World War II, when the US government forcibly relocated the Unungan people from the Aleutian Islands, thousands of miles away to Southeast Alaska, and 10% of the population died. Sorry, I'm not seeing the next. And then decolonization is the intelligent and active unlearning of colonization that perpetuates the subjugation and exploitation of minds, bodies, and lands. And it's the restoration of cultural practices and values taken away or abandoned, and the birth and use of new ideas, which are critically important in the context of the climate crisis. I now want to talk about polar amplification because for those of you who do not know, the Arctic is warming now 3 times as fast as the lower latitudes. Not that long ago, as recently as last year, it was twice as fast as the lower latitudes. And to just give a context, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has aspirationally set our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And in Alaska, as you can see from the map on the left of the screen, we are already far above that 3 degree Fahrenheit increase. And it's important to remind everyone that 1 degree separates melting from freezing. So with these temperature changes, we are seeing extraordinary changes to the Arctic and the rapid reduction of Arctic sea ice. So on the slide to the right, you can see a graph showing Bering Sea ice, and it has dramatically dropped off, which is critically important to the Alaska Native communities that are along the coast, because Arctic sea ice is the natural barrier that protects communities from the storms that we get in the fall and winter. We don't yet have hurricanes in Alaska, but we have hurricane strength winds, where it is regular now, where we get winds above 70 miles per hour. And without that Arctic sea ice, it is causing ustek, which is a Yupik word. It means catastrophic land collapse. And in work that we did with natural scientists and indigenous scientists, we defined catastrophic land collapse as the combination of thawing permafrost. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground, erosion, and then flooding. And it is Ushtek that is causing communities to face the decision of whether or not they can stay in their homelands. As I mentioned, we work with 15 Alaska Native communities. They were all identified now well over a decade ago as being identified, I should say, by the federal government, which has done numerous reports about what is happening in Alaska in regard to the climate crisis. This report in 2009, which was done by the US Government Accountability Office, identified actually 31 communities that were imminently threatened by flooding and erosion, and 12 of which were thinking that relocation was going to be their best long-term adaptation strategy. We work with 15 of those communities. 2 of them decided to relocate well over a decade ago, and neither of them have been able to relocate because of the colonialist, racist structure of our government policies that are not providing these communities with the resources that they need so that they can implement their long-term adaptation strategy. I should also mention that these 2 communities voted. So their tribal governments voted, they have city governments. People within these communities voted to relocate because they identified this as their best long-term adaptation strategy. And both of these communities are still in extraordinarily dangerous places. They're on barrier islands and have not yet been able to relocate. So the heart of our work is about this issue of planned relocation, community relocation, where an entire community, and in Alaska, these are Alaska Native villages, but it could be a neighborhood, it could be a city council government where, or jurisdiction where that entire place needs to relocate because of extreme weather events and, for instance, saline intrusion and erosion. So it's really important to me that we define what this is. So first of all, it has to be voluntary. And I mentioned the government forced and mandated relocations. That cannot be the model that we use in this context because of the harms that I already described. And voluntary, it's important to protect the right to self-determination, meaning communities make the decision of when, whether, and where they relocate. It's a disaster risk reduction strategy, which means that relocations need to happen before an extreme weather event that displaces people, like Hurricane Ida just did, where people now are in crisis. They need food, shelter, water, healthcare, and that is not a good time to make these really difficult decisions about where to go, and how I can be resilient in the long term. It's planned, which means that it is a really long-term process, meaning about 5 years. If all the resources were provided to communities so that they were able to make all of these decisions, and including the building of infrastructure. Now in Alaska, communities want to move. So the 2 communities that I spoke about made decisions to relocate to a relocation site that protects their ancestral heritage. And in other communities, identifying where to relocate to build that infrastructure, because in Alaska, there is no infrastructure at the relocation sites. In other places in the United States, people will be moving to communities where there is infrastructure, but maybe not sufficient to meet the needs of all the people who are going to need to move there. Protecting human rights is fundamental. And as I mentioned, the right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect. And we often think about this in the work that I do and with the scholars and academics as about moving infrastructure. But at the heart, this is about people and people moving. And how can we make sure that people will be safe, strong, and resilient in the face of losing the places that they love and live? And then it's critically important that social and kinship connections are protected and able to be sustained at a relocation site if that's what people choose. So the heart of the work that we're doing with 15 Alaska Native communities is visioning what this governance framework should look like. I've been doing this for over 16 years. With the tribes that we work with, we've been doing it now for about 7 years. And this is the governance framework that we came up with, where you create a dynamic response as the climate crisis accelerates. It's important to understand that the climate crisis is not going to end at the end of this century. It is going to go far into our future. So when we are creating governance structures, they need to be governance structures that can be dynamic, iterative, and collaborative. And we always start with protection in place. Communities need the resources to protect their homes and the places they love and the places where they live before we ever come to think that relocation may be necessary. And the heart of the work that we're doing with the tribes now is identifying what we call relocation indicators, those social and health and well-being indicators that determine that it is no longer possible to stay where a community is because the land is being submerged and is going to become uninhabitable. So there are 4 governance issues that we focus on. It's important to understand that there is no governance framework, not only in the United States, but anywhere in the world to deal with this issue. And that is something that we are really trying to change. We have written comments to the US Senate multiple times. We've written comments to different federal government agencies. And I worked with the Obama White House Council on Environmental Quality, pushing them to address this critical issue. So there's no state or federal government agency in the United States that has the mandate or funding to do this. There is no institutional framework to determine when this needs to happen. Who decides? That needs to be legislated so that we are not in the position of a government making the decision not to protect people and forcing them to relocate, although that is already happening. I am very well aware that decisions are currently being made about who to protect in seawalls. And if you look at what just happened with Hurricane Ida, the government of Louisiana and New Orleans made decisions about who to protect with their new multi-billion-dollar levee system and left out many coastal communities, including tribal nations that were devastated by Hurricane Ida and now scrambling and struggling to figure out whether they are going to be able to stay in their homelands. And then where do they relocate to? Where is the place where they can find the place where they call home? And then again, how can collective and individual human rights be protected? So at the international level, I've done a lot of work with the UNFCCC. I've done work with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees on this issue. And the challenge is there is no human rights document that specifically addresses the critical human rights that need to be protected in this context. However, as you can see on the screen, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, all of these human rights documents contain the essential human rights that need to be protected in the context of a community-wide relocation. And those are the right to life, the right to self-determination, as I mentioned, the right to traditional foods, the right to practice and revitalize cultural traditions, and the right to improve and maintain livelihoods. So one of the communities that has been trying to relocate for now over 20 years is the community of Newtok, Alaska. They are the community that has moved furthest along in their relocation process and is still excruciatingly, painstakingly slow. And their tribal elders developed the guiding principles to guide their relocation process so that as their community relocated, these are the principles that to guide that process. What was critically important was that they remain a distinct, unique community, always their elders for guidance, a healthy future for their youth. Their voices come first, which is part and critical of decolonizing these systems that have forced them to live in vulnerable places. So places like Newtok and other communities along the coast were forcibly placed there, not by a government decision saying, you have to go here. It was the government decision that said, you have to send your children to school. Barges dumped off construction materials at the places where the schools were going to be built. And if the parents did not send their children to school, they were threatened with imprisonment. So this caused the sedentarization of the coastal communities, not all of them, but many of them along the west coast of Alaska. And prior to that, they were migratory. They moved with the animals that they harvested. And this was not, again, this is not ancient history. This happened in the 1950s and 60s in Alaska. So the heart of what we're doing in creating this governance framework is a community-based social health and environmental monitoring, where community members are gathering the data about the environmental impacts using their traditional knowledge and also working with natural scientists to gather the information about the slow ongoing environmental change that is happening in their community. And then what are those impacts? Because one of the reasons why this is critical is that our disaster relief and response legislation in the United States does not acknowledge slow ongoing environmental change as a precipitating event to get access to funding from disaster relief and response. It is a giant gap in our federal framework that needs to be rectified. And community-based social health and environmental monitoring is one of the ways to do that, because people, indigenous communities, are working with natural scientists to understand the predictive rate of environmental change of Ushtek, for instance, so that they can make these decisions in advance of Ushtek causing the collapse of buildings within their community. And then finally, we work with indigenous communities, specifically in the South Pacific. And in 2018, we hosted the first Peoples and Indigenous Peoples Conference convening on climate forced displacement, because it is critical that Indigenous voices be heard by the international community so that they are leading these efforts in regard to how they can adapt and protect the things that are important to them. Thank you.
Well, I have bad news for Juan, because after these two speakers, it's just stunning what we've heard from you. Robin, I'm always struck by the United States government always says there is no money to do something until something goes wrong, and then we go afterwards spend 10 times as much as we really might have spent if we had really planned in advance the things you just laid out. I've been thinking about climate issues for a long time, and I have never heard someone talk about the need for a relocation government agency. And yet what you've laid out really begins to look that way. One of the problems with someone that's been around government a lot is whenever the government decides, oh, we'll create a ministry for this, we'll create an agency for it, it then becomes even less productive. And the politicians can say, oh, well, we got a ministry here or an agency, we won't worry about this at all. And to get these issues to the forefront, and honestly, I think Alaska is at for such a rich state, it's really underspent on this. And I know it's not a rich state when you look at individuals, but when you look at the extraction industry, it is wealthy in that sense. By the way, the south of Louisiana is also an extraction industry victim as well. When you have these meetings, are you getting any kind of response to the need to think about this more seriously? Do you have leaders in the U.S. government, for example, that are speaking to this? I mean, does John Kerry get this?
Yes, and John Kerry, came to Alaska with President Obama in 2015. So they specifically came to Alaska because of the advocacy of the Alaska Native tribes, and specifically one of the communities, Kivalina, that needs to relocate. I think it's really important to understand that most governments in the world, including the United States, have zero desire to manage the internal movement of people. And one, of course, is because of the historical legacy that I talked about. But the other is the complexity of these issues, of what we've set in motion. And, the collaborative governance framework that we are seeking to build requires a lead federal government agency that can access the resources of multiple different federal government agencies, because it is going to take those multiple federal government agencies like HUD, Housing and Urban Development, like the Department of Transportation, to provide the resources to address the needs of people who are no longer able to stay in the places they call home.
I'm really looking forward to the dialogue, because this is, I'm going to use an odd word, but almost a shattering presentation, in the sense that the scope of the challenges that you face with smaller communities are really going to spread across much larger areas of our planet going forward. And really, thank you for your work